Welcome, everyone. We are going to get started. By the clock in the back, it looks like we're about 5 after 1. So welcome to those in the room. Welcome to those that have logged on in Zoom. We are super excited. My name is Jessica Carrillo. I am one of the division chiefs here at the Department of Social Services, Fresno County. We are excited to bring Dr. Bruce Perry to us today live and in person with us to share the model that we hope everyone in Fresno County that works with high needs youth and their families will learn and use. It is the Neurosequential Model that looks at all of the factors of someone's life. How to build resiliency, how to connect to important people, to actually do practical interventions that improve wellness and coping. And so we're super excited. I'm not going to take too much more time and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bruce Perry.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I am very happy to be here, honored, in fact, to be here to share some of our work. And I am very much looking forward to the partnership that we are creating with our colleagues in Fresno County. What I think most of you kind of have a feel for this, but most of what we want to do today is give a little bit of an infomercial sort of for you to learn a little bit about the neurosequential model and get some details about how we are thinking we will roll this out within the county. The morning is, going to the afternoon, actually. The first part of this is going to be me talking a little bit about the development of the model, a little bit about the rationale, the reason that we have selected certain parts of the model. And then there will be a little bit of a Q&A with me. And then afterwards, you'll have an opportunity to talk with two people who have been active in the neurosequential network community in California. And they have a tremendous amount of experience grappling with some of the same things that we will deal with as we bring this to Fresno County. I think all of you know that there are a lot of aspirational models and aspirational plans that once they meet the reality of the systemic challenges in any given community or organization, they stall out. And one of the things that we've tried to do as we've developed this approach over the last 30 years is build our approach in a way that it is practical and affordable and at the same time sustainable. That we realize that public systems have a lot of unique challenges. The child welfare system, public education, mental health, early childhood, juvenile justice, all of them are grappling with tremendous challenges and challenges that are dynamic. They change. So you can go through all kinds of efforts to create a reasonable program response to something that's happening. And lo and behold, over the 5, 6, 7, 8 years you do that, the needs of the community change. And so this is part of what we've tried to address to some degree in components of the model. So I am a physician, for those of you who don't know that, and you may know that physicians are constitutionally incapable of presenting without slides. So I'm going to share my screen and use slides for the rest of the presentation. And hopefully you won't be completely intimidated by this. Don't worry, I'm not going to show all of this. I'm going to show every one of these slides. No, I'm not. I'm lying. Let me put this up first. This is a this is a list of places where you can learn more about the neurosequential model. There are a couple of bigger websites, these top sites up here. For those of you who want to look at some of the handouts or some of the articles that we have published recently, you can go here. There's a YouTube presentation that is about a 29, 30-minute overview of the neurosequential model. And uh, I'll talk about some of what's in that video today, but this is a really nice, quick reference for those of you who want to share with somebody some of the things you hear today. And it's easy. It's a couple years old, but it's still pretty relevant. All right. So the origin of this model started 30 plus years ago when I was a young training child and adolescent psychiatrist. And for those of you who know this, that in order to become a child psychiatrist, you first have to become a general psychiatrist. And before you become a general psychiatrist, you first have to become a physician. And so I was in medical school, and I had come from an undergraduate experience where I was a neuroscience major, and I really was fascinated by research and by the brain. And so when I started medical school, I had the aspiration to also be a scientist and try to learn more about how the brain works and that sort of thing. And I thought that medical school would teach me about that, but when you're in medical school, you don't really learn that much about how to do research. And so I took a leave of absence from medical school, went and got my PhD in the neurosciences and studied the development of the stress response systems in mammals, including humans. So as you all have probably heard in one way or another, that we have these systems in our body that are involved in helping us manage challenges, novelty, stress, trauma. And these systems are essential to keeping us alive. And they're very, very important in really every aspect of functioning in our bodies. But when those systems are stressed or challenged in certain ways, they can cause secondary issues and problems that will manifest as physical health problems, behavioral problems, social problems, emotional problems, and so forth. And so there was we certainly knew this from the neuroscience research, which was vast, that demonstrating the role of these stress response systems in behavior. And as I was becoming a psychiatrist and sitting with children who had difficulties with attention or socialization or learning, I kept thinking that these things that I'm seeing with these children remind me of the kinds of functional challenges that I've been seeing in these animal models, which involve the manipulation of the stress response in ways that lead to altered function. And so I started my work as a clinician thinking about the importance of the brain. And one of the things that I always, there are times when I'm talking to groups, parents, colleagues, I like to think about the power of the brain and why it's important to understand the brain, because of the tremendously central role that the brain plays in all of these things that we're supposed to be dealing with in mental health, for example. So you really can't talk about emotion and about thinking and about moving, even about sensory perception, without realizing that the brain is involved in all of those functions. And so the analogy I use a lot is to think about the brain as the engine of a car, and that most of us who learn a little bit about parenting or interacting with our peers or dealing with other human beings kind of do that a little bit like we learn how to drive a car. We learn the certain rules about what you do to turn it on, and how what pedal makes us go slower and what pedal makes us go faster. And we kind of know a lot about how to make a car function appropriately, and we learn the rules of the road. And that's kind of what happens with learning how to deal with human beings. And we learn that certain kinds of things lead to appropriate reciprocal social behaviors. And if you practice certain motor activities, that you'll get better. And if you listen to the teacher and they instruct you in cognitive things, you'll learn those cognitive capabilities. But every once in a while, your car breaks down. And when the car breaks down and it doesn't work right, it doesn't turn on, or it stops in the middle of a highway, um, we don't really know what to do. We open up the hood and we look at the engine and we don't know what to tweak. We don't know why it did that. And we have to rely upon somebody who then comes and helps us because they understand how the engine works, and they tweak the right thing and they move the right thing and they say, you need to change this or you need to add that. And they go ahead and do that intervention. And lo and behold, the car is working normally again. And that's the way I think about what we're trying to do with the neuroscience part of the neurosequential model. We're trying to help teach people a little bit more about the brain and human behavior and human development, a little bit more than just the simple rules of the road and the simple details related to turning to the right, turning to the left, and that stuff that governs normal human behavior when the engine works completely properly. But what we now know is that there are times when, due to either the developmental context or a genetic history or intrauterine experiences, that parts of the engine are going to develop differently and work differently. And the more you know about how we function under the hood, the more likely you are to be successful at opening up the hood and saying, all right, I see what happened here. You didn't get enough of that. We need to add a little bit more of this kind of experience. We need to back off and have different expectations. We need to tailor our interactions with you to fit where you are developmentally. And this is a big part of what we're trying to do with this model, is help people get a little bit of understanding about what's under the hood when it comes to human behavior and the way it manifests in everyday life, as well as in situations where there's incredible adversity or when there's are other challenges that stress, distress, or overwhelm the systems in the brain. So one of the big dilemmas was when I started integrating the neuroscience work into my clinical practice was that I was swimming in jargon. I had spent years and years and years and years and years learning obscure factoids about receptors in certain parts of the brain and why they would respond to certain medications and why they were changed by certain developmental experiences. And when I started to talk to people about these factoids, you could see, even though I had good intentions and I knew a lot of stuff, and I was ultimately going to get to the point, people would drown in the factoids before I could even get to an explanation of how I thought the neurobiology was influencing their current functioning. And pretty soon I realized that not just in my basic research in communicating my findings to colleagues, but in my clinical work and trying to explain the neuroscience principles to colleagues and to parents and to educators in ways that would allow them to act on that, I was overloading people with too much information. And so I started to simplify. I started to, in the beginning, I started to use a very simple upside down triangle that I would hand draw. And I'd say, listen, I know Billy's coming in here and Billy has a history of asthma. And Billy's got sleep problems, and Billy's got difficulties with relationships, and Billy is impulsive and has learning problems and has an increased startle response. And because of his asthma, he's going to see a doctor for his lungs. And because of his social skills, you've put him in a social skills group. And because of his reading problems, you sent him to a tutor. And because of his speech and language problems, he goes to see a speech and language person. And because of his sensory integration problems, you send him to an OT. And because of his impulsivity, you get him prescribed medication. And the truth is, all of these people have different language for what Billy is experiencing. And I just want to let you know that here's what I think. I don't think Billy has 5 different things or 6 different things in this example. I think what's going on with Billy is related to one thing. And then I would say, let me just tell you a little bit about how the stress response systems in the brain work. Turns out that there are these really important neurotransmitter networks down here, the systems that are involved in stress: norepinephrine, adrenaline, dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine. And collectively, these things, they actually go and influence and play a role in function in all these different parts of the brain. So the part of the brain involved in reading gets input from these systems. And the parts of the brain that are involved in managing impulsivity get input from these systems. And the systems involved in sleep get input. And the systems involved in regulating your lungs and the sort of the neuroimmune response of your lungs get input from these systems. So rather than having 6 different disorders, I think Billy, because of his history of developmental chaos, developmental abuse, and neglect, Billy actually has a sensitized stress response system. And that if we actually help that system, he'll get better in all those domains. Now, that was the beginning of me starting to create a bunch of more systematic heuristics to try to explain what I thought was going on, and then to try to use that explanation in a treatment planning model. And in the beginning, it was very crude. Literally, it was hand drawn. And over the years, we started to develop much more sophisticated, what we call heuristics. And I don't really want to necessarily read this, but a heuristic is basically a model. It is a way to summarize and approximate a solution in a quick way, whereas it might otherwise take you a lot more effort, a lot more energy, and a lot more, if you will, content to get to the same point. So we use heuristics in everyday life all the time. And we use heuristics. Some of you are familiar with the heuristic that Dan Siegel developed to talk about how the brain's organized, the hand model. He talks about the thumb going as the inside is the limbic system, and your fingers over that is the cortex at the top of the brain, and down here's the brain stem. And that's an incredibly useful heuristic for helping people understand a few fundamentals about the structure of the brain. But this is a little bit more detailed heuristic. Now, this is really very accurate. It's a drawing, but it is also a model. It's not, the brain's not see-through. You really can't see through the brain, and all these systems are not colored. So this is a model. And the key thing to remember about heuristics and models is that they're basically wrong. The question is, are they able to capture enough of something that is true to be useful? And that's what the neurosequential model is trying to do. And even the name of this is intentionally trying to tell you that we're going to use a neuroscience lens, the neuro. The sequential part, we're going to talk about the sequential development and the sequential processing of information as being central concepts to truly understanding what's under the hood, how your brain really works. And if you do understand that, there's all kinds of things that make sense. And the model part is an open acknowledgement that, listen, we understand that the brain's not an upside down triangle. We understand the brain's not a layer cake. We understand all kinds of stuff. We understand that functions really can't be localized to just one region of the brain. However, we believe that when you use that heuristic that's capturing some elements of truth, that you can get very, very useful content and useful process elements that will improve the way you understand a child struggling in school or a child who's experiencing mental health symptoms after trauma. And it will also help you understand just the basics of how human beings function. There are several, the neurosequential model itself involves the use of these heuristics to help people understand a few core concepts that have utility across the board. They have utility and they will help improve your understanding of behavior if you're a policeman, if you're a judge, if you're a parent, if you're a mental health provider, if you're a child, if you are a movie maker. No matter what you do, if you understand some of these core concepts, you will understand things in a different way. You will, in many ways, have a deeper understanding of certain things that are common in your everyday life. And if you are doing work with individuals who struggle, it will be tremendously valuable in the way you put together programs and practice, and ultimately, we hope at some point, policy. So the neurosequential model itself involves a big component that's about this capacity building. It's about learning about how the brain's organized, how the brain develops, how the brain changes, how the stress response systems work, how they change when you have certain patterns of activation. And we believe that even just that part of this, even just learning a little bit more about these areas, you will end up seeing areas in the way you do what you do, where you can make tweaks and additions and modifications that will improve the outcomes in your system. And we've seen this happen in juvenile justice, in education, mental health, and lots of other systems when that happens. Just building the capacity, not using any of these advanced clinical practice tools that we've developed, just learning about the concepts, it leads to about 1/3 of the improved outcomes that we see. Now, let me take a minute and talk about one of the key sort of central concepts that we use and apply across the board. And actually, before that, let me just take 1 second and talk about this. So I showed you the upside down triangle brain. I just want to, again, sort of remind you that the intention of this model is to be able to have a heuristic that has flexibility to be incredibly simple, and if needed, to be a little bit more complex. And I think that that's been that balancing point has been a really challenging part of the development of our work, is that, who are you working with, and how many factoids do you need to know? I mean, do you really need to use the jargon related to the amygdala and the hippocampus and specific parts of the cortex when you're talking to a parent about trauma? Probably not. Do you need to have a clinician understand this wiring map? Probably not. If you are doing in-depth study and you're doing neuroscience research about something, you really do need to be aware of all these factoids and all these concepts and the interrelatedness and the complexities. You have to have some way to incorporate that into your work. But if you are like we are, if you're just trying to help build an awareness of these concepts so that people can act on them as parents, educators, caseworkers, therapists, you don't need all of this stuff. And at some point you may want to bring these detailed things in, but you want to start at least with the core principles that will help organize all the factoids that you're going to get exposed to as you take a deeper dive into the neuroscience. And one of the most important, if you will, organizing frameworks for understanding stress, distress, trauma, attachment, really so many different elements of human functioning, is having an awareness of what we refer to as this core regulatory network and the microarchitecture of these systems. And so you'll notice that I didn't use any jargon here. This is just a collective network. But it is comprised of, for those of you who like jargon and want more details, it's comprised of serotonergic, dopaminergic, noradrenergic, adrenergic, cholinergic systems that collectively go everywhere in the brain, everywhere. Every single part of the brain and every single function in the brain is influenced by these core regulatory networks, is either mediated or modulated. Furthermore, because these systems have direct output to your heart, your lung, your gut, your skin, every organ in your body, either directly through the autonomic nervous system or indirectly through hormonal systems and your immune system, this architecture, these core regulatory networks are the logical backbone for your stress response capabilities. And if people that take a little bit of a deeper dive into the neurosequential model learn a lot about the stress response. And it's way beyond the regular, the light touch kind of trauma 101, where people learn about the hypothalamic pituitary axis and cortisol and all of that. Those are parts of the stress response capabilities, but those are only a part of our incredibly vast and complex stress response capabilities. We have stress response capabilities that help manage hunger and thirst and cold and balance, and as well as all the other things that have to do with overt external threat or internal threat related to hypoxia, lack of oxygen, or dehydration and so forth. Now, the other important part about this slide is this. These core regulatory networks are able to go reach everywhere and influence everything. Furthermore, all of the feedback, all the sensory apparatus from your body, from in your gut, you get feedback about how much glucose you have circulating, you get feedback about how much oxygen you have, you get feedback about how much sodium you have, do you have the right balance of salt in your blood, all that kind of stuff. You get that feedback and it goes to the lower parts of the brain, so that these networks can then go, okay, I need more of this. I need to do this. I'm have a lack of oxygen because I've been running upstairs, so I need to stop running upstairs and start walking, or maybe even sit down and take a rest. So my oxygen can catch up, circulating oxygen can catch up. Furthermore, everything you see, hear, smell, taste, all of the sensory inputs from the world come into lower parts of the brain and communicate in some way directly to these core regulatory networks. Really important thing about this. Now, just keep that in mind, and let's go back and look at this heuristic. One of the things about the brain is that function comes from complex interconnected networks in the brain, which usually span multiple regional areas. However, it is not that inaccurate to say that certain functional capabilities depend upon the presence and activity of networks in certain parts of the brain. In other words, to some degree, you can localize function in the brain. And one of the things that we know is about the brain is that all of these complex functions, thinking, your sense of time, your ability to reflect on the past, your ability to anticipate the future, the ability to memorize math and history and your personal narrative of your life, all of those capabilities are on the top part of your brain. They're up in the cortex. So your cortex is this incredibly important part of us. And if you compare what is in the human cortex in terms of genetic expression, that is the most uniquely human part of your body. Every other part of you is genetically very similar to other primates and other mammals. The most uniquely human part of you is your cortex. And it is no surprise then that the most uniquely human functions come from cortical networks and systems that involve the cortex. Now, this is really important because another one of the things that you'll learn in the neurosequential model is a little bit about the architecture of how sensory input comes in. And I kind of already said this, that feedback from your body and your interoceptive input and your external input from your primary senses, the first place that actually gets input from those sensory components is lower parts of the brain, which can't tell time. So the lowest part of your brain, the part of your brain that has the most categorical, simplistic reactivity, the part of your brain that solves problems in a very dichotic way, is getting your experience first. So when you hear something from a teacher, when you see somebody that you are meeting for the first time, the first part of your brain that starts to make judgments about that person is a part of your brain that's very primitive. And then the information is passed to the middle part of your brain where the judgments, again, there's a second shot at interpreting this experience. This is a very reactive part of your brain. This is a very emotional part, and it's in the top part of your brain is where rational cognitive capabilities emerge. So the human brain is organized, and we'll talk about this a lot as we build a capacity in the neurosequential model. Your brain is organized to act before it thinks. It's organized to feel before you think, which is a really important sequential organization when you think about the adults telling children to think before they act, to use their words. And when a behavior, impulsive behavior is observed, and you sit Billy down, and it turns out that he does know the rules, right? He knows the rules, but the rules are up here. Your interpretation is Billy did that on purpose. Rather than recognizing that, maybe that behavior was elicited because the input from the world had to go through all of his stored experiences. And maybe there was an evocative element that was stored that made his brain think that he might be under threat. Because the truth is, these parts of the brain can't tell the difference between when the present and the past. That's basically one of the most common observations in people that have evocative cues from post-traumatic stress disorder, or evocative cues from other kinds of early developmental experiences that may not manifest as that disorder, but all of us have evocative cues based upon our earlier developmental experiences. That's what implicit bias is. And that's a whole different, area. But understanding the sequential development of the brain and the sequential processing of information leads to an appreciation of what we call the sequence of engagement. As I said before, the brain's organized to act before you feel. And let me give you an example of that. All of you have been in the kitchen and you've accidentally touched a hot pan, and you've withdrawn your hand, and literally you may not realize this, but the next time you do that, think about it carefully. You actually don't feel the pain of the burn before you remove your hand. You remove your hand before you actually feel pain. And then after you feel the pain, you actually look over there and go, whoa, what was that caused that? It was that hot pan. So that's an example of this sequence of engagement. And in everyday life, if a child is very dysregulated and they're acting impulsively and basically you want them to change their behavior, we talk to people with this weird expectation that they're going to actually follow through, like calm down. It has never worked, and it never will work to tell people who are anxious to calm down. It's not the way the brain's organized. And that leads to this important element of the sequence of engagement, that if you want to get to the cortex, if you want to reason with somebody, if you want them to hear you, you want them to learn what you're teaching as a math teacher, the most efficient way to get there is to take advantage of the neurobiological organization that humans have, where we are fundamentally relational creatures. And the superhighway to the cortex is through a relational interaction where you are made to feel safe and regulated. So if somebody makes you feel like you belong, you're one of us, I'm listening, I see you, I hear you, then that person will be much more likely to be open to a suggestion from the person who makes them feel safe, as opposed to somebody who's sending signals that I really don't see you, I just want you to follow my rules. And if you're dysregulated for any variety of reason, you're going to have less efficient uptake of the cognitive content of that interaction. And we talk about this quite a bit. It's one of the core concepts that we build into all of our neurosequential model versions. Now, there's a lot of, this is sort of no, I'm not going to go into that much detail. All right. So one of the other key, there's a couple of key concepts that I'm going to just give you a little bit of an infomercial touch on before I talk about the actual model and the clinical practice tools that we've developed to try to help us understand people. One is what we call state-dependent functioning. And what we know is that when an individual feels safe, they function differently, they think differently, they feel differently, they move differently, they literally physiologically are different, their heart rate's different, the neuroendocrine profile that they're exhibiting in that moment. When you feel safe, you are literally physiologically different than when you feel threatened. And what happens when you feel threatened is that there's a state-dependent shift in what systems in your brain are recruited to work and what systems are turned off. And let me give you just again, a heuristic version of how these core regulatory networks manage incoming signals of threat from the external world. So the first stop of that input is down in these core regulatory network. And at this point, they will take in the incoming information, compare it against previously experienced threat-related cues, or if it's completely novel, they'll activate the threat response as well. Because novelty, new things until proven otherwise, the default response of your body is that this is not good. Now, it may turn out to be good, but in the beginning, your brain acts as if it's not good. That's why, and we talked about this in an earlier session, that's why when you bring, this wonderful, innovative new thing to a program, a lot of the people immediately reject it. They don't even hear about it. They don't want to hear about it. Their default response is, it can't be good. It's going to be threatening. It's not, I've done this a million times, blah, blah, blah. So the default response to novelty is threat. Is the perception that you're perceiving this is threat, this is danger. Anyway, whole different lecture, could go into this in a much deeper way, but I will not right now. In comes the threat. The brain starts to, the lower part of the brain starts to recruit other parts of the brain. Up here is the amygdala. Now, a lot of you have probably learned Trauma 101, and people talk about, oh, amygdala is the fear center. And the reality is it's not the fear center. It's involved in interpreting emotional content. It does way more than manage stress and fear and threat. And it is not directly connected to any input from the outside world. So all of the input to the amygdala has to be filtered through previous analysis and processing and passing that information on up to the amygdala. But it is important in this response. But the key, again, if you understand the sequential nature, you come to completely different conclusions about the way you talk about the amygdala when you're helping people understand threat and trauma. And then there are other parts of the brain that are involved in the threat that get activated. So under threat, there's a graded response that in the beginning, you activate these other systems. And as you activate systems to help you, you also, and this is very important, you also start to deactivate systems that are not in that moment going to help you. And by and large, what your brain does is it shuts down the rational parts of your brain that are involved in reflecting on the past and anticipating the future. So your sense of time collapses to the present moment, and all you care about, you don't care about your family reunion in 2 weeks when you have to bring the potato salad. You worry about the saber-toothed tiger that is pacing at the outside of your campfire. That's what you care about. So all of that other stuff goes out the window. You shut down those parts of the brain. And this top down, if you will, threat related shutdown of the cortex results in a loss of both relational, i.e., empathic and sympathetic capabilities, as well as cognitive capabilities. People who are extremely threatened are fundamentally organized and fundamentally activated for their self-preservation. Even if, and I know that there's this tendency to think, that some, and it does happen sometimes, if it depends on the degree of threat, but people's sphere of concern collapses the more threatened you get. If you are worried about how you're going to pay for your apartment for your own kids and your ability to keep your children safe and clothed and housed, your concern about the lives of people in other countries that are being challenged by war, famine, natural disasters, it collapses. It's a lot easier to care about others and be empathic and concerned about the rest of the world when you feel safe. When you don't feel safe, you care right here a lot more about your family, and right here you care a lot more about yourself. And so this state-dependent functioning is absolutely essential for us to understand, because if you're a person right here and your worldview is, oh, you should be concerned about this, you should be concerned about doing this for your kids and this for your kids and this for your kids. And the reality is, listen, I don't care about that shit for my kids. I just want them to have a place to stay. I want them to have a meal tomorrow. I don't care if they play soccer. If I miss the soccer meeting, I don't care about that. I care about, am I going to be able to make enough money so I can feed them tomorrow? And we over here, who have the privilege of regulation, we always judge these people through the lens of our own safety. And that, again, that's a whole different lecture, but I better get off that high horse right now. All right. Couple things about this. If you go back and you look at this primary heuristic that we use all the time, and you think through what you have been learning about ACEs and risk, you've learned that developmental adversity of all sorts increases your risk for learning problems, for affect regulation problems, for substance use and dependence problems, for physical health problems, for immune system problems, for problems that have to do with your endocrine system like diabetes, and every single other mental health thing that you can conceive of. In other words, if you understand that these systems, when they get activated in ways where there's unpredictability, in ways that are extreme, or if it's prolonged, that creates a sensitization, a change in overactivity and a overreactivity in the stress response system of these of your core regulatory network, which puts you at risk for a whole lot of things. It changes your fundamental stress reactivity curve, which means that when you have developmental trauma, you then are put on this merry-go-round of increasing vulnerability and risk. So if you have had adversity where there has been unpredictability, extreme and prolonged distress, you also end up with a sensitized stress response, which means the next time you have a moderate challenge at work or a moderate challenge at school, instead of acting in a way that will get you what you need, you'll act in a way that shows fight or flight behavior or shutdown behavior, all of which will get you typically in trouble with the adult world or with other people in your life because they don't understand why you're acting that way. And so then starts another cascade of actually, instead of understanding you and backing off and trying to regulate you, you continue to have these expectations that these people, this is not such a big deal. I don't know why they can't get to court on time. I told them when the date was. I don't know why they can't do this. I don't know why Billy can't make the transition from lunch to first period or third period or fifth period, whatever it is, without having a meltdown. It's because we don't understand them. We do not understand that these individuals have had some combination of sensitizing experience that could range all the way from intrauterine insults to early developmental attachment disruptions to any pattern of sensitizing stress response experience, including, and this is so important, including an experience of being marginalized and minimized as an immigrant or as a person of color or as a person of poverty or as a person who doesn't have the right body size. You can get shamed into having a sensitized stress response, even though there's no big traumatic event that people will point to and go, oh, Billy acts this way because of course he saw somebody get shot or whatever. That you can have the same physiological change in your stress response reactivity and get the same risk just by being excluded and minimized. And again, this is an area where people have not been very appreciative. Fortunately, there is more and more awareness of the power of those experiences, both to make somebody feel excluded and minimized, but also the converse, that the power of healing, the power of addressing these issues has to do with making somebody feel included and safe and valued. And that when you do that, that can lead to the exact opposite. That can lead to experiences and challenges that will heal and then ultimately build resilience. And this is part of what we try to do when we use this model, is that we try to work with folks to understand how do we make things that are unpredictable more predictable? How do we help people learn that to take an extremely activated stress response system and learn techniques to moderate that? How do we take situations where there's all kinds of prolonged and chronic things to make it less chronic? How do we help individuals learn about agency? You have more control over things than you sometimes feel. And when you start to do that, you can build environments where people heal and get better. And this is one of the aspirational elements of the work that we do. But all of this treatment planning, all this figuring this out has to do with really understanding the individual trajectory of the person to the present moment. We have learned, and I think our field has learned, even though it will not act on it, we have learned that one size fits all therapeutic approaches do not work. Now, when I say that, that doesn't mean that any of those approaches are wrong always. In fact, almost all of the approaches where you try to provide therapeutic help, whether it's psychopharmacology or EMDR or neurofeedback or traditional psychodynamic psychotherapy or sand tray work or play therapy, all of those can be really helpful if they're provided at the right time in a way that's developmentally tuned into where that person is. The problem is we typically as clinicians don't have that playbook. We don't know where people are. We don't know what their developmental trajectory is. You know, you can have two kids that have exactly the same phenotype. They behave the same way. And then if we just use that, like attention problems as the guiding principle for treatment, without understanding that one person's trajectory was completely different than this person's trajectory, we'll end up giving both of these individuals the same thing. And that's why literally one of the biggest problems we have in our field is the mess of comorbidity and the misunderstanding and the misapplication of our interventions. And part of what we're trying to do with the neurosequential model is to address some of these challenges in ways that allow us to not only use the evidence that we already have to try to do, we believe in evidence-based programming and evidence-based therapeutic work. We think evidence is important, but what we recognize probably more than most people is that we don't have enough evidence. And what people are calling evidence is really scant and flimsy because we don't have studies that have the duration that they should, and we don't have appropriate comparators. So part of what our responsibility, I think, as people in systems providing services the best we can, is that we create a program and practice delivery model, whatever it is, in a way that allows us to measure what we're doing. We have got to generate evidence while we are trying to help people. And then we have to have a mechanism to see that evidence and see where this worked, where it didn't work, and then continue to tweak and modify and improve our ability to target the kinds of kids who are going to respond to EMDR. What kinds of kids are going to respond to TFCBT? When should we use neurofeedback? When should we use a predominantly somatosensory intervention? And if we learn how to do that, we're just going to help everybody a lot more. So this is kind of what we've tried to do. We've tried to put together a structured process to, number one, build capacity around these core concepts. And we teach the people that become certified and learn how to use this model. We teach them about a lot of these concepts, about attachment, about development, about trauma, about sensitization, about resilience. And then we've also have developed a semi-structured process to do an assessment, to basically use what we call our clinical practice tools, which are metrics of sorts, measures of sorts. And what we want to do is we want to get some understanding of what has been your trajectory to the present. What are the bad things that have happened in your life, and when did they happen? What are the good things that happened in your life that protected you? Are you connected to community, culture, family? Has that been protective, and how? And so part of our assessment looks at the past, excuse me, and part of our assessment looks at the present. And two big areas that we look at in the present, number one, we look at current functioning in a way that allows us to create a heuristic reconstruction of their brain and how well organized it appears to be in relation to other children or youth or adults that are the same chronological age. And the second thing that we look at is their current connectedness, because this turns out to be the most powerful predictor of how well somebody's going to do. So all of this in service of being an evidence-generating practice, all of this is done in an online, guided, semi-structured way so that the responses, the answers, the numbers, the scores get put into a data set that allows us to comment on individuals, but also allows us to pool data over time and start to make comments about some of these very complex challenges and questions. Now, for the clinician, what we're able to do is create a report that helps the clinician literally get a visual representation of how well the individual is organized compared to age comparison children. And to make this kind of, oh man, I'm already late. The way we do this is that we use our heuristic. So if you think about, here's our upside down triangle brain. And basically we're doing the opposite of what you would think of like as a neuroimaging study. Neuroimaging studies look at sort of brain activity or brain size, brain structure in some area, and then they see if it's correlated with some function. And we do the opposite. We look at the function, and we basically say, listen, if I learn a little bit about this person's sleep, I'll learn a little bit about the diencephalon, because I know that systems in the diencephalon are involved in sleep. And if I learn a little bit about this child's ability to read and write and everything, that tells me a little bit about the cortex. And if I learn a little bit about their ability to form and maintain relationships, that teaches me about some of these limbic structures and so forth. So we use a functional inventory to create essentially a picture of that individual's brain. Now, the truth is, all of our conventional assessments give us information about different parts of the brain. So if you do a WISC, you're learning a lot about the cortex. If you do a trauma symptom checklist for children, you get a lot of information about different parts of the brain. And so basically, we're simply putting together a set of existing questions and responses that allow us to create this brain reconstruction. So if you take a typical newborn, what we do in the scoring model, and again, I don't want to get into the weeds too deeply, but just so you understand these colors, the scoring is basically comparing the existing functional capability to two groups. One group is you compare the existing capability to regulate body temperature, for example, to a fully organized, typical young adult. And in a newborn, we know that they can regulate their body temperature they have the precursor capability to do it. It's not exactly like adult-like, but it's almost there. They can, if they're not a preemie, they can kind of regulate their body temperature. In their cognitive capabilities, they're nowhere near adult-like in the manifestation of abstract cognition. And a year later, though, they've got a brainstem that's starting to look a lot like an adult, and they're beginning to get the precursor functional capabilities that are more adult-like. They still have a cortex that's significantly unlike an adult, but it's emerging. These capabilities are emerging. And so we've got all of these comparison maps, and we're able to then take what we get in a clinical situation. And, oh, this is our early childhood map. I keep doing that. Let me go over to this one. So this is from a metric report. This is what an age typical 8 to 10-year-old would look like in terms of their organization of their brainstem, and their cortex is starting to show all the precursor capabilities. This frontal cortex is, it's not, it still has a ways to go. But if you look at the client and look at where they are, they've got profound underdevelopment in a lot of areas. And so what we know is that this is a 9-year-old child that has the neurobiological capabilities of a much younger child. And so when we put this child in a social situation where he should act like a 9-year-old, you will predict that they will fail. And of course, they fail in any group activity. And then we get mad at them, and then we sort of label them different, and we try different things. But what we try to do with this model is that once we get that understanding, we put together a treatment plan. And a treatment plan that basically is much more targeted at where they are developmentally, so that we have a higher probability of being successful at whatever it is we're doing. And the fundamental idea really is to select and sequence experiences and activities that are both enrichment, educational, and therapeutic, that will plausibly provide the density and the nature of experiences that can improve systems and networks that are in that area of the central nervous system. And that's basically the overarching idea. And it's actually worked out pretty well. I mean, we have a tremendous uptake of this process, and a lot of it is because the people that have been using it tend to spread it by word of mouth. We're actually a pretty small organization at our core, but we have a huge international and sort of a huge reach in our partnership relationships with other organizations. And so since we first manualized the model in 2008, we've developed a lot of different certification levels. We've created a version that we use in education, a version that we are using for parents, caregivers, for sport. We've got an early childhood version that we are developing, and actually Dr. Christy Brandt, who's one of the co-developers of that version, will be with you for Q&A. And we continue to try to get better at implementation and export, and the impact of this has just been pretty significant. It's grown pretty significantly. We have presence in like 25 or so countries where there are people either in education, child welfare, mental health, that are using this approach. And again, the model is designed to be a framework. It is not intended to replace existing practices or existing assessment models. It's intended to complement those activities and help clinicians shift their reference and their frame of reference from the way they're doing work currently to be more developmentally attuned, and to be a little bit more focused on some of the principles of neuroscience that can be helpful in their work. And we have a lot to learn, but we have a lot of activity already in a lot of really excellent clinicians and programs underway in California. And we're very much looking forward to having the project in Fresno move forward and develop a cadre of people that have expertise and the capacity to continue to help with sustainability in Fresno. Our intent, honestly, in almost all of our efforts is to try to externalize any expertise that we bring to an issue. We want to build regional expertise so that those individuals and those programs and those organizations will then work within their sphere of influence to bring about further dissemination of the ideas and practices that are helping. And because of that, we've emphasized a train the trainer model and an advanced mentor version of this, where these senior folks, the people that are trainers within a system, can train others in their organization in this phase one. People who are mentors can provide program consultation and independent certification of individuals who are wanting to do phase one. So ultimately, after 3-4 year process, we have the intention of externalizing the training process to the point where it is sustainable within the organization that we partner with. And so our aspiration is that ultimately, within the different major systems in Fresno, there will be a lot of people who will be doing internal training, capacity building, and figuring out how these concepts and practices best fit with the activities that are taking place within their systems. Now, when I'm sure you have some questions. I'll stop in a second. One of the things that you will be able to benefit from after I finish talking is there are two of my colleagues and friends Dr. Christy Brandt, who's an amazing person, and Tony DeMarco, also an amazing person. Both of them have been very active for a long time in our neurosequential network community, and they can talk with you and answer questions about their implementation activities. Again, part of what I really want people to appreciate is that, it's always easy for me to come in and talk like, oh, this is all this great stuff, but it's really hard. It's this bringing change to any system is very hard. And we try to work very closely with whoever, whether it's an individual or whether it's a system, we try to create a meaningful, productive relationship so that we can sustain some of the bumps that are inevitable when you try to make this kind of change. So we're looking forward to getting to know lots of you and working with all of you, and more than anything, learning from all of you. The majority of the good things that we do right now in our exporting of this have really come from feedback that our other partners have provided over the years. And we look forward to the same kind of opportunities and feedback from all of you who choose to be involved. And I think I better stop right there and see, I could talk forever, but I shouldn't. So it's not a good thing. I should stop talking.
So one thing that I wanted to ask you, as we're trying to model in Fresno, a lot of our partners haven't necessarily heard of this model. And even the name of the model is intimidating. So how do we talk about this with our judges and court education partners so they even come in the room and hear and don't think of it as something that only mental health does?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you bring that up. We had a long time ago, we had a number of conversations about the name, and the name is intentionally challenging. And because I don't know if you've noticed this, but how many trauma-informed whatevers have you heard of, right? And it means nothing, right? There's like, who the hell knows what that means anymore? Literally, people get together and have conferences to decide what trauma-informed is for this, for that. So I said, listen, I don't want to go simple. People can understand this if we'll just explain it to them. And so now, with that said, I certainly appreciate the challenge of bringing new ideas to folks. So here's what we've been able to do. Over the years, we have been able to have people who are in our system who are occupational therapists who are trained in this. We have judges, we have police officers, we have principals, we have superintendents of school districts. So what we do is when there's an initial interest in bringing this idea to some system, we help the introducer, like let's say if you want to introduce this to your school board, we would have you talk with people in our system who have successfully implemented this in Aurora or in Scotland or in Tasmania, and they have published data and outcomes. And then we let the superintendents talk to the superintendents. And we let the heads of child welfare talk to the heads of child welfare. And so we have published outcomes from child welfare systems where the model has been compared to other things, and it's superior to work as usual. And so when it comes to introducing stuff, we actually recognize that it needs to be a trust-focused, relationship-building process rather than a dog and pony show. And that's why I always refuse. Everybody that we've worked with, why don't we have glossy brochures? And I'm like, no, we're not having any glossy brochures. No, we'll talk to people about what we do, and they can make up their mind if they want to do it. And we'll bring in a judge. We've got, right now, I just got an email. We've got a huge program with the federal Ninth Circuit about these concepts. We just finished a big series about introducing the neurosequential model into courts that we did with the Superior Court in LA County. And so if you have judges that might be interested in this, I'll just have them talk to Judge Salas or some other judges that I know. And then you all decide, here's the deal. We're in no hurry. We know that if you want to go far, you got to go slow. If you sort of say, oh, we have $1 million and we're going to shove this down the throats of all of our caseworkers, I'm like, I don't want your money. I want your time. I want your attention. And I don't want everybody's attention. I want the attention of people who really have kind of an open mindset. They're ready to do a little bit of hard work. And then as they build their strength, their comfort, their capability, what happens is people around them begin to see what they're doing. And then they're the ones who are going to be the most persuasive, if you will, representatives of the ideas. So that's kind of what we do. And I know that it's a little bit antithetical to the way government works sometimes, because they get waves of funding, right? So all of a sudden the state or the federal government goes, oh, we're going to have a huge amount of money for trauma-informed schools. And they give a school district a bunch of COVID money and they don't know what to do with it. And we are not one of those groups that's going to say, we're going to take your money. We're like, listen, we over time, you may want to invest in something, but we go slow. We build relationships. We want you all to build relationships with each other, because if that doesn't happen, real change never happens. And so that's what we do. And I admire people who are skeptical of the latest alphabet soup crap, because it's all over. I mean, our field is just permeated with people who claim, that they can bring world peace if people everybody did neurofeedback. It's like, wow, what a disservice to neurofeedback. What happens is people go, well, world peace didn't come, so I hate neurofeedback. But that's not right. Neurofeedback's okay. You just got to do it at the right time with the right people in the right context. And that's kind of what we're trying to do, is get people to just slow down. We want the system. This is why we're having the organizational part of this process, which you'll hear about. Systems are just like people, right? When systems get distressed, they shut down their thinking part of their systems as well. And they make all kinds of dumb decisions about changes in policy and practice. When systems kind of take the brakes off and give the thinkers and the leaders time to think and do due diligence and kind of do things properly, you get better output. So that's kind of what we try to encourage. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but.
My name is Ivana Carter. I'm a social worker in the public defender's office. So there's a small group of us social workers working alongside our clients as they go through the process, juveniles and adults. And I don't have so much of a question, but I feel like I have this opportunity to talk to Dr. Perry. This is amazing. I really appreciate being invited to this session. When we work with our clients, we've read your books, our team, and we've read the research, and our favorite question is to ask, what happened to you? No one decides to come into jail and have the behaviors. And so I am really excited for the potential to be certified in this. And learn how to articulate in a short-term manner to the judges, to the district attorney, how to present this information to help them understand the need for rehabilitation and the need for services, and going into prison is not going to help and get them better. And then especially for our clients who are possibly being resentenced, be able to write a story to present this information. So I just want to say thank you, and being in a space with you is quite the honor.
Well, I'm blushing, and thank you very much. Yesterday, I actually was on a podcast with two guys that are in prison in North Dakota, and I actually have do a lot of work with individuals who understand the impact of trauma and are now in prison and are doing mentoring and all kinds of things. But I look forward to working with you to try and do all of that stuff. And we have. Again, it's going slower than some people want, but we're creating the intentional content and process to bring this into courts, so that folks like you will have the supports and the tools that can help them do some of that work.
No, Dr. Perry, there are two
Oh.
questions in chat.
Okay, all right. Is evidence-based? Yeah, we have lots of case studies and statistics where this is used in social work, not as much in probation. But a lot of this, we actually have several writings and a lot of content that we've developed that's used in that arena. If you send me a note, we can send you some of those materials. And what are the most common barriers? Fabiola, that's a great question, because honestly, I in the beginning, when I first started doing work with bigger systems, I had this weird fantasy that if you just tell people, just give systems evidence or tell them something that makes sense, that they'd actually act on that. And turns out that's not the way stuff works, I guess. So evidence is good, but systems don't change based upon the presentation of evidence. And my favorite example of that is all the stuff about early childhood. We have an ungodly amount of evidence that shows that providing safe, stable housing and social supports for young parents who are pregnant and then have their children, if you do that in the first 6 months, you'll have incredible bang for your buck, a return on investment of almost $9 per dollar invested. Yet we still can't get either state or federal government to truly invest in those programs in a meaningful way. So even in the face of evidence that will save government money, we can't get implementation of program stuff. And so I do think that one of the major impediments right now is the duress and the stress that people in systems feel. And one of the core concepts that we talk about is state-dependent functioning. And when systems are in, I don't want to say crisis, but when they're in high distress, their capacity to take in new content and change is very, very, very low. And so it's, we are literally spending time trying to figure out better ways to help systems make change, because we've been so bad at it in the past. So when I figure it out, I'll do my best to share it with you.
Thank you so much.
This is Kim Smith. I am with Fresno County, and I have a question. So as we are working, moving everything forward, I'm just wondering, as we are in training mode, what does the transfer of learning look like for social workers as they are learning this process? How does this translate into working with youth actually in the field? How does that translate?
Well, it depends. I mean, part of what happens is many people who are doing that work in the field, the major translation and feedback about that we get is that the concepts that we teach reinforce what they feel they should be doing and what the system is impeding them from doing. And so at some point, we end up talking a lot about moral injury. I think a lot of our systems are set up to put the people in the front lines in a contradictory situation where we burn them out. We create moral injury and they leave the system. And so that's one of the manifestations, is that when people hear about some of these concepts, they feel better about, they find language for the things that they kind of already knew. They knew, for example, that it was probably more important that they help the mom do the dishes than they checked the box because they conveyed the little paragraph about how important it is to look at your baby when you feed them. So that's part of what I think is the translation of learning some of these concepts. Now, the dilemma is I'm not in a position to change your system. And it does magnify the sense of frustration in many cases. Now, what I'm hopeful for is that because when we do work with the system where there is every intention to try to be better, and we're teaching not just the people in the front lines about some of these concepts, we're helping people that are at supervisory levels and leadership levels, that at some point they go, well, that means maybe we should do something like this. And you're like, well, yeah, right. You should think about transitioning the transitional process. You should think about the fact that, that mom's not going to really process that information accurately if she doesn't have someplace to stay. So you do it is an opportunity for people who have influence to tweak the system, not necessarily change it, to begin to think about what are some innovative tweaks that we can make where we can basically, work around some of the existing impediments. And so that's what I think happens. And we've seen this happen in, there are a couple of places in child welfare where this model has been used quite a bit, a lot in Australia. There are a number, the province of Alberta is adopting the model within their child welfare system. And a big part of what we are trying to do, well, is they've got a lot of senior level and policy level talk about equity. And they've got a lot of frontline work where people are learning about better ways to kind of be with others. But in the middle, there's this whole systemic bullshit that is encrusted and is so it has its heritage in feudalism. And so everybody kind of knows we have to change it, but figuring out how to change it has been very challenging. Now, with that said, there's a lot of really interesting little promising things happening here and there. But there's no doubt that when people learn a lot of these things, when I talk to people, for example, about the fact that if you took every single clinician in Fresno County and they dedicated 100% of their time to the needs of the children and families that had been acutely traumatized in the last 6 months, you'd fill their entire schedule. Which basically means that our current model will never meet the needs of the community. And so what we have to do is think about different models. We really have to move out of the medical model and into the community and recognize that there are aspects of culture that have always had aspects of regulation and rhythm and relationship and healing, that instead of trying to break cultures, we need to reinforce culture and use that and reinforce that in ways that are going to lead to health. And but sometimes that's not something that our colleagues who use the medical model like to hear. They like to hear that if you come and see me once a week and I do TFCBT, you're going to get better. And they don't. So I better stop. I know I'm probably pissing people off. So.
Thank you.
Oh, hi, Jason.
Hi, greetings. I'm so glad to have you here. I'm also, like Ivana, very excited to be speaking to the great and almighty Dr. Bruce Perry.
Well, if you hang around, you'll learn different if you spend more time with me.
I actually saw you about 7 years ago, so it's great to see you again. My curiosity is around the perspective. The neurosequential model is built around a clinical perspective. Are there other tools for folks like us who aren't clinicians to implement this? Yeah. And then I'm also wondering, is Fresno as a county, all of these different organizations signing on to really support this movement for Fresno? Or like you said, is this just going to be another phase that we go through, and then in a year we're still frustrated and unclear about how to move forward? Yeah,
good question, Jason. So first thing, we've got a neurosequential model thing that we use in sport. So we teach youth coaches and high school coaches, middle school coaches. We have the NME, the education version, which is very, very successful. And then we have a lighter touch version that we're working on that's much more about community engagement, how do you teach some of these concepts when you've got just like a neighborhood meeting, and that's all you have. And so we've got content that we can give to people, but we're still working on that sort of engagement process. So, but to answer your question, and I can send people a link to a presentation I gave about how to respond to the huge disasters that have happened in the Middle East. And this is initially targeting an earthquake where like 100,000 people were killed. And the reality was, listen, we can't use the medical model to get ourselves out of this, and it'll just never will happen. And in fact, this is an opportunity to recognize that our existing mental health system is not meeting our needs at all. We have long waiting lists. We have lots of ruptures of treatment after a couple of visits. We're not going to be able to train new clinicians at a level that will get us out of this mess. And in fact, what we really need to do is help build strength in communities and take advantage of the strengths that are existing in communities. And so what we're trying to do is figure out the best ways to help those communities integrate some of these concepts and bring language to what they already know. So it gives a certain degree of validation when they get pushback from educators or from other people, because there's always a pressure to pathologize a lot of behaviors that shouldn't be pathologized. And anyway, you and I probably could have lots of conversations about this.
So what does this mean for Fresno? What are our plans to bring the neurosequential model to our community? So can we put up our timeline, our plan? The start of our timeline is today to have this kickoff experience with Dr. Perry directly. But with that, Fresno County has partnered with the Department of Behavioral Health and Department of Public Health to actually have certification cohorts kick off here locally. Part of that plan is also, as Dr. Perry talked about in his presentation, to train local people, not just about the model, but how to train the models to others. And so within our cohorts, we have a trainer for trainers. And so within our first cohort, we're going to get kicked off. From that cohort, we're going to identify those clinicians who want to become trainers. Then we're going to kick off our next cohort. Certification training takes about 10 months. So it's a full year commitment for those folks in our cohort. And we are very happy and privileged that people did want to commit to this. So we have our first cohort already selected. And then next year, we'll be kicking off with our trainers who were trained, our trainer for trainer, to co-facilitate the second cohort. And then certify more clinicians and people in the Department of Social Services and others, give them a more in-depth training about the model and its aspects. Then we have a third year to which we are going to do the same thing. In our second cohort, we will select more trainers for trainers. And then that selection will co-facilitate and train our third cohort. So we have a 3-year plan that you can see, well, barely see with the small boxes. But in addition, then we have 2 additional years that we are committed to continue to build capacity and bring it out to more of our partners. We though also, in addition to having the cohorts and the train for trainers, we are going to bring general trainings through the neurosequential team to offer to non-clinical staff. So to our DSS staff, to our partners, our education, our probation, our public health nurses, they will be able to participate and view the general trainings. And those will happen throughout the 3 years as well. And so additional information, how does this reflect and support our community overall, not just from a therapeutic standpoint, as Dr. Perry mentioned, but in a communal wellness standpoint. And so more information, more training will come out just generally to our community. And so that's our plan. We're super excited about it. But I want to turn it over to the experts in the room to explain a little bit more how they have applied and spread the model in the work that they have done in their communities. So I would turn it over to Christy, who's going to come up and introduce herself and share her information.
I'm Christy Brandt. I'm actually from the Napa Valley, up north, about 4 hours from here. And I first met Dr. Perry in 1998 when he was lecturing in Sacramento for the Attorney General in the Safe for the Start program. And as he was speaking, I had the same experience that maybe a few of you have had. I went, oh, this really makes sense. And we were in the process of opening up a therapeutic childcare center to serve our parents who were in recovery programs, who were in mental health programs, behavioral health now, who are also in our brain injury programs. And it just made sense to invite him to be one of our key informants for the process of developing that childcare center, which opened in 2000 and is still open to this day. Based on a neurosequential model. So that's my background related to that. I've been using it for 25 years, elaborating it into the neurosequential model and reflection and supervision, and also working with Dr. Perry on the neurosequential model for early childhood. So for full disclosure, my expertise is really the 0 to 5ers. That's where I spend most of my clinical time and my training time, and run the Infant Parent Mental Health Fellowship through UC Davis. And so I'm so delighted that Tony is my partner here because she goes full lifespan. So for those of you who aren't like me, that you're with the 0 to 5ers alone, she'll take you the rest of the way, I promise. And also she has great expertise in building out what we will call the therapeutic web. So I'm delighted to be here with all of you. Any questions before I get going? Pretty good? I'm so glad you're here today. So this is a neurosequential model of therapeutics, NMT, and we're going to go from case abstract to intervention. And this is a step-by-step process that I know many of you will be trained in. So this slide is about the guide that is on the dashboard of all the individuals who do the neurosequential model training. On that dashboard is a case abstract that's 13 pages. And so we actually start out with knowing the client and then being able to fill in this case abstract. Oh, thank you. I'm being able to fill out this case abstract, and it's a bullet point kind of abstract. So no long narratives are needed, just the bullet points that help the clinician to begin to fill in the metric as they get to it. So it's for the user, specifically for that purpose. So it's not in addition to the work that you might already be doing. It's specific to the submission of the NMT data. And this is how the metric actually opens for someone who's using it. So it will fill in the date for you and so on, but you can use a pseudonym, you can use a case number, you can redact the name in other ways. I typically use initials and the date for myself. And then that moves you on to the next components, and you can see those at the top up there. So part A, part B, part C, part D. And I think when you just hear that, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but our part A is about adverse events at each developmental age. And the import of that is, as we think about therapeutic interventions, we want to think about what were the neural processes underway when adversity might have been faced. And that will help lead us into what kinds of interventions we might use. And then we go to part B and think about the relational health at each developmental age. So that'll tell us something about the buffers that were there for this child or individual that we're working with. Dr. Perry touched a little bit on that. And then part C tells us where we are right now. So we look at what happened in the past to get us where we are in terms of the adversity, what happened in the past as the buffers, and then we get to where we are now in terms of neural functioning. And he showed you a slide on that as well. And then part D finally is the current relational health. In other words, what's the sort of treasure chest we have for being able to select interventions? What's the relational health component? What is the therapeutic web around this child? And do we need to add to that or reinforce it, or is it rich and we can tap into it right away? And then here are the points in time that we'll be looking at. So in doing a metric, any of you do the training, you'll be looking at adversity that might have happened in the perinatal period. In fact, we'll actually start with intrauterine, but the perinatal period, birth to 2 months. And then you'd be looking at that in infancy. So there may not have been adversity in the first part, but maybe the second and third parts, for instance, or vice versa. And then we look at early childhood, second year to age 4, childhood 4 to 10, youth age 11 to 18, and finally adult 19 to 24, but it can go on throughout the lifespan. So again, keep in mind, and those of you who might be taking notes, that the purpose of getting each of these indices done is that it tells us the neural process is underway, so what might have been affected. So a good example of that is one of the developmental steps for young children is separation and individuation. So if you imagine that we have a little one about to begin kindergarten or first grade, and at that point, perhaps the child's parent dies. And so right at the point at which separation and then individuation was needing to be conquered, instead this child is without a caregiver and grieving. So then we would know, oh, with the adversity happening at that time, perhaps one of the challenges is within this particular developmental milestone. So we'll look at the adversities and then the relational health at each of these points in time. Any questions about that part? Oh, great. And so why do we do this? And part of it is around the concept of equifinality and multifinality. So in equifinality, what we might think about is that there might be different causes for the exact same symptoms or signs we're looking at. So in this case, I put in hypervigilance. Maybe a teacher says this child is never settled in class. They're watching everyone who comes in. They're looking out the window. They're looking out the door. Any sound, they're turning their head. They're distracted all the time. And we could think about what could lead to this level of hypervigilance. Certainly, we could see it in a child with PTSD. We could see it in a child who's been exposed to domestic violence in their home. We could see it in a child who has ADHD and many other diagnoses or conditions. So all of those could lead to what we're observing as this hypervigilance. And as we begin to think about how to address that as one of the challenges this child might be facing, we'd be thinking about what got us here. So Dr. Perry had that lovely elaborate slide saying people could get here, but the pathways into that particular situation could be quite different. And then it would actually change the ways that we think about intervention. And so multifinality is sort of a different aspect of this, that we could have cause B, for instance, in this case, I'll put domestic violence in the home, the cause B. We could have outcomes like dissociative disorder. We could have PTSD. We could also have hypervigilance. So whether we're looking at the cause or we're looking at the signs that we're seeing, we have to know the pathway that took us there, when it happened, and how we might intervene around that. And so is it possible for us to even be neurobiologically sound, to be relationally aware, to be psychodynamically solid, to be developmentally grounded? Yeah, it is possible for us to do all of those things. So next slide, I think, coming up to Adam. One more. There we go. Okay, so we'll be talking about the case of Adam. This was a child that I came into the life of this child with a social worker who was newly out of a training program and had been hired by a school district that had a large school set aside for special ed. And she joined the faculty there and was working with children who had different needs. And after a while, she learned the NMT and she contacted me to say, could we take a look at this child together? Because after weeks of kind of the standard intervention, she wasn't seeing any change. And so we'll call this child Adam. So a little bit of the history on Adam. Adam's mother, Caroline, was a victim of domestic violence before, during, and after the pregnancy. And Adam was first assaulted himself at age 2 months. There were serial assaults and emotional abuse of both Adam and his mother, verbal abuse, forced separation, control, intimidation, terrorization toward both Adam and his mother, humiliation and degradation. Mother and Adam were battered severely at 22 months, but this was a long history of some very severe abuse in the household. At that point, the father was sent to prison and died shortly after release 5 years later. Attachment, relationship, and dyadic interaction was seriously impacted. So Caroline, at one point in the interview, she said, I felt like both Adam and I were prisoners in our own home. She was kept in her master bedroom, and the child was kept in his room, and the father would not allow either of them to see each other. So she could hear him crying, but could not go to him. Later, that'll become important because I think often when I talk about this case, people wonder, why didn't we start right away with mom doing something different with this little child? But mom herself had experienced so much trauma and was so in need of her own much-deserved therapy that we needed to start first with her getting what she needed and Adam getting what he needed. So here were the diagnoses for this little 8-year-old. PDD-NOS, pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, and at the time, this was a very popular diagnosis, the next one, complex rapidly cycling bipolar disorder of childhood. These are big diagnoses. How many of you see these? Same diagnoses. Anybody? And so he was on medications, including, you see the two that are listed for him. So in doing the metric for Adam together, I want you to take a look at what we saw when we looked at his current functioning. So see, it says CNS functioning there. And if you look at the totals for his CNS functioning, you can see on this slide, it should be about 317. That would be a typical child at this age. And instead, he was 133. So his actual functional state was much younger than what an 8-year-old should be. And in fact, if we do the math on it, he was about 3 years, 6 months in his functional age. This becomes really important for us because a chronological age is often what we address. But in this case, we need to look at what was the functional age for this child? What level are they actually functioning at? And so for any of you who think, well, that could never happen to me, or I've never seen that. Actually, anytime we get upset, we're probably a 1 to 3-year-old. We get really upset or angry with someone. We drop down in our functional age. If I'm having an argument with my husband, I know I can cooperate. We can problem solve. We can collaborate. But when I'm way down on the brainstem, those things don't happen. So throughout the day, we'll notice that this actual functional age for ourselves is driven by our stress response systems. When they're activated, we lose functional age. When they're regulated, we go up at our functional age. And then the next area to look at in the metric are these 4 items: sensory integration, self-regulation, relational, cognitive, and cortical modulation ratio. So if we did the average on these, take a look at how he looked in his functional domains about 2 years, 10 months. So he's an 8-year-old for whom we could provide interventions, but in reality, we're looking functionally developmentally with a child who's just over or just about 3 years of age. So we'll shift what we do. And the example I used earlier this morning is that one of the things that didn't happen with Adam is he didn't get cuddled and held and rocked like a baby might. And he had trouble with transitions. So when babies are small, we help babies transition when they're going to sleep. Like we wrap them and swaddle them, we pat them, we might rock them this way, or we might sit in a rocking chair and rock them to help them go to sleep. We're actually teaching the child how to be awake and transition to the sleep state. And then if a baby wakes up, we might pick them up, good morning, and hold them against us and pat them. Hey, it's a new day, and maybe start to feed them or change them and get them ready for the day. That's how children begin to learn transitions, even though we might find, oh, they're 7 now and they have trouble transitioning into the school in the morning or transitioning home in the afternoon. So with Adam, we'd be thinking he did have challenges with transition. How could we create something that he missed that might help him in this area, but be appropriate for an 8-year-old? So I'll talk in a moment when we look at what some of the suggestions are, because this is such an important criteria for us to think about. So the chronological age, you could look at the day that someone was born, but also when children are quite small, we might do an adjusted age. So if you're preterm, by 3 months, we might adjust your actual age by that 3 months so that we'd have an adjusted age. We know that we're looking at a child who might be a little younger than the birth age because of being born early. And then the developmental age, which you already saw, and then the functional age. And that functional age is driven by our stress response system. So this is a brain map similar to the one that Dr. Perry showed you earlier, and this happens to be Adam's. And so if you look down at the bottom, an age typical 8 to 10-year-old, you see lots of green areas there. And notice if you look over to the left, the green areas suggest that they're developed and pretty typical. And so we should expect to see that. But when you look above at Adam's brain map, you don't see that, do you? Instead, we see lots of areas that are in their precursor capacity in pink there, and maybe a little moderate dysfunction, and then down below underdeveloped and severely dysfunctional. So this gives us an even greater picture of what's happening with Adam, because if we look at those high cortical areas up at the very top, you see that his are severely dysfunctional and underdeveloped. So if we were to put him into cognitive behavioral therapy, it wouldn't really work because he doesn't have the cognitive capacity for that. So it begins to tailor what we might use to be helpful to Adam. And then here's another way to look at it. Take a look on the lower left-hand side. What you'll see is an area that talks about the relational health, gives us information on that. And if you look in the green area, if that blue box in the middle of that other box next to it, if it were way up into the green area, it'd be enriched relational health. In the yellow, it would be adequate. And in the blue area, the reddish area, sorry, it would be impoverished. So look where Adam is, impoverished in the relational health area. And then after completing the metric and looking at all those sections, we also have recommendation sections at the very end that will tell us something about essential things to do for this child, then therapeutic things that might be useful, and then enrichment that might be useful. So we'll look at those for Adam. And but first, also thinking that therapy or therapeutic is having healing powers and serving to maintain or restore health or well-being. So today, I hope you leave with a new definition in your mind for therapy. I asked a group earlier, when someone says, oh, this child is in therapy, what does that typically mean? Anybody? This child's in therapy. What's that? Might have issues? Is that what yeah, that child might have issues. That might be why they're there. So it could be a code for that. Anything else? Yeah. Child is getting help. So there's something helpful that's going on with this one. I tease my fellows. They're typically with us for 15 months. I always say when someone says, well, they're in therapy, I goes, what kind? What are they seeing? Or they're seeing a therapist. What kind of therapist? Oh, well, you know, a therapist. Well, you know, there are lots of different kinds of therapists. So I really want to kind of get an idea about what we're talking about when people say, oh, they're seeing a therapist or they're in therapy. So it's helpful for all of us to think about, what does that mean when someone says that to me? So I like to embrace this. So it's a little more expansive, and it'll tap into what Tony's going to talk to us about the therapeutic web and the community. And this was a quote I heard from Bruce Perry 25 years ago at that talk in Sacramento. Primary principle for infant parent mental health therapy. Therapy is not about erasing old stuff. It's about creating new positive experiences. So if we could start to change our idea of what therapy is, it's not getting rid of the old stuff. It'll never be gone. But we are going to create new positive experiences that allow the brain to rewire in different ways. So imagine that I'm a small child. Every time I cry out, either my parent doesn't come at all, or my parent comes and they hurt me when they come. Some of you know that babies are often abused by being pinched on their inner thighs during diaper changes, handled harshly, and so on. And so the baby's brain begins to wire in a way that says humans are not safe, and you don't know what will happen when they come to you, or people will not comfort me and come to me when I need it. So we have to think about what would be the processes that might eventually support a person in seeing humans as helpful, safe, someone you could depend on. So that's part of that idea of how we're going to be looking at where did problems occur, and now could that help lead us into what the therapy selections might be. So here it is for Adam in sensory integration. Examples of somatosensory activities for Adam could include massage, pressure point, Reiki touch, music, movement, swimming, walking, running, jumping, swinging, rocking, yoga breathing, and animal-assisted therapy that includes patterned repetitive activities such as grooming, petting a dog or cat, or brushing a horse, or moving along rhythmically. In fact, we used to tease Dr. Perry, be like, wax on, wax off. Do any of you remember that? That was repetitive. And so if you look through this doesn't look like therapy, does it? Swimming lessons, perhaps, or running with a group, or rocking or drumming. It doesn't look like typical therapy as we know it. And then self-regulation. This is Adams again. Examples of essential activities in this category include developing transitioning activities, using songs, words, or other cues to help prepare the child for change in activity, patterned repetitive proprioceptive OT activities, and so on. You could read through that. So in Adam's case, where transitioning was hard, we had to think about in the center where he was, could they use music as a cue? Oh, the music changes predictably at certain times of day. And so I know that means we're moving to the next activity. So I had one early care provider working on this same concept. And she said, we have the music that's a cleanup music. So when the cleanup music comes on, it's not the teacher saying, oh, we have to clean up now. They're like, oh, there's the cleanup music. So now we have to start to clean up. And so it helped children transition from the activity they were doing without difficulty and move to the next one. And we had to do the same exact thing for Adam, thinking about how we would learn to transition from one activity to another. Because again, in his early development, he had no support with someone else to help him learn to transition. And then in the relational world, we'd be looking at examples of kinds of interventions we might use: art therapy, individual play therapy, parent-child interaction or PCIT training, dyadic parallel play with an adult, and when mastered, dyadic parallel play with a peer. So one of the things about Adam is his age. So occasionally someone will say, well, this 8-year-old ought to go play on a soccer team for 8-year-olds. How old would Adam be on the soccer team? About a 3-year-old. What do 3-year-olds do with a soccer ball? They take it and run off with it, right? And so it wouldn't be unusual for Adam to act like a 3-year-old. He didn't interface with lots of peers. In fact, if we had his full history, you'd find that he actually only interfaced with about 5 people until he went to school, and then he was so disruptive in school that he often was isolated in school. And so to start him out in one of the highest levels of play. So remember, the lower levels of play is a baby learns to play with their own hands and their own feet. And then the baby begins to play with items other than themselves, and they begin to look at others and watch their play. And then eventually they could do parallel play, sitting next to someone while we both color, or we both play with sand or blocks. And then eventually I could play with that person. So we would now exchange things like putting a puzzle together. We would play cooperatively. And then the next step is I'd go to team play. And so Adam's far, far away from that. He's at a much younger age and not ready to do this next big step. So you could look at some of the selections that we have here for him. And then the next one in cognitive, because you saw how delayed he was there. Examples of essential cognitive activities include speech and language therapy, insight-oriented psychodynamic treatment, cognitive behavioral therapy, or family therapy. And in a moment, Tony will talk about that, how to help regulate the whole family in order to benefit from family therapy. So it's not just a one and done, it's often very inclusive of the larger family. And then in cortical modulation, which literally means, can the cortical networks higher in the brain really help me with my reactivity and keeping myself calm and well regulated? And Adam didn't have a very high cortical modulation ratio number. And so in here we'd be looking at this item can provide useful when determining, prove useful, it should say, when determining whether a client's ready to benefit from traditional cognitively based therapies. So we'd watch that CMR ratio. If it went up, it would tell us that, oh, this child might be ready for more of the traditional talk therapy, and in particular TFCBT or other cognitively based therapy strategies. But here's the real hook on all of this. So we have to think about the creation of memory, which is what all these things are, like learning to transition, feeling like people are safe, being able to engage in play. All of these need sufficient stimulus to the neural networks we wish to change. so that enough signal is sent to modify or resculpt synaptic connections. That's why we need to go back and find out what was under development at the time that adversity occurred. And so could those particular neural networks be affected? And Dr. Perry showed you when it was related to sleep, related to reactivity, and so on. So we get a pretty good hint about where we need to go. But then also we have to have spacing and adequate time for neurons to create, move, integrate new proteins into multiple synapses that we want to see changed or that have been created. And this takes a lot of time. I've seen parents who'll say, well, my child's seen you for 4 months or 4 sessions really of therapy. Aren't we done now? How many of you have had that happen? Isn't this enough? How much is enough here? They've been coming for a year. What's enough? And so let me skip that one. And so in the NMT metric, we're going to be looking at the metric report. We're going to be looking at the functional developmental age for appropriate interventions. And then what does my community have to offer in terms of its therapeutic web? And again, Tony will be talking extensively about that. And then we have to decide what's the time, what's the place, and who is going to be the caregiver for this intervention. So would it be something based in an early care setting or a 3rd grade classroom teacher? Would it be the parent who's home? Would it be the grandmother who might see the child after school? Would it be someone else that this child sees? So how would we figure this out? In fact, I use a particular rhythm with our fellows where we often want to think if there's a great hour in a child's week, could we just reproduce that great hour? If they love going over to their auntie's house after school, could they stay 1 more hour if it's a good therapeutically supportive hour? You've seen that side. So I'm going to give you an example of what happens when we encounter new content and what's going to happen in our brain. So this little one is learning to eat off a spoon. How many of you fed a baby for the first time? Anybody? Okay, where does most of the food go in that first attempt? Yeah, it goes all over. I saw this gesture. That was great. And so we use a spoon to wipe it off and try again. And the tongue doesn't know yet what to do. And so the tongue will thrust forward. And when that happens, all the food comes out. And after a few attempts, maybe even a couple of weeks, the baby finally figures out how to get that bolus of food around in their mouth and swallow it. So what takes time? In fact, one of the things I love is the first time a baby sees their hands, again, I don't know how many of you have children, but a baby's in their hands, all along, the hands are moving. And then one day the baby goes, and they have this look on their face, like, who put that up there? And then we know that within 2 days, they can move every finger. But at first it was a shock to know, oh, those are mine and they belong to my body and I can move them. And so we're following the same pattern. They're going to get this spoonful of food and it's going to take them a while to figure out, I can master this. And here's why. And I know it's probably a little neurobiologically boring, but promise me it really works that what's going to happen? I either need to grow new neurons to tell me how to swallow that food, or I have to recruit some neurons that are already there to help me figure out how to swallow. That's what I've got to do. And now to make these changes, those neurons have to connect to each other. So I've got to recruit new neurons or grow new ones, and then they have to connect, as you know, in a synapse. And then once the synapse is made, a blood vessel has to actually grow into that synapse to be able to feed the synaptic connection. And after that, we have 2 kinds of cells that are glial cells. There's lots of different cells in the brain, but astrocytes come along and anchor everything together and nurture and supply nutrients to that connection. And then oligodendrocytes come along and they myelinate. We all know about myelination. It speeds up the process. So they have to grow. So we grow a blood vessel, and then we bring in astrocytes, and then we bring in the oligodendrocytes. And there they are, nicely myelating to speed up the efficient transmission. And then we have to grow a protein. And the protein is going to be uniquely tagged. And this is an oversimplification, I know. And a neuroscientist might present it differently, but I think this is really the way we have to consider it. We're going to grow a protein that helps the message move from one synapse to the other. So we actually grow a protein here. And then we have to grow docking stations on the other side. So when the protein moves from one to the other, elaborate a protein, docking station, elaborate a protein, docking station. And so this is what an artist rendering looks like for that. This is those proteins moving from one neuron to the other one and moving into docking stations. And the very famous brain scientist, Eric Kandel, he said, to build a memory that lasts hours, days, or years, neurons must manufacture new proteins and expand the synaptic docks to make the neurotransmitter traffic run more efficiently. So this is happening every time. Maybe you picked up a guitar and decided to play that, or you learned pickleball, whatever it is, you had to do this exact same process every time you learned something. And then I lay down the memory, and I need to be able to retrieve it without remodeling it too much. So I need to know how to swallow that spoonful of food the right way over and over again, and that's part of it. And then I change my behavior and I can achieve it. So I usually say it takes 10 steps to change your mind. And they really take a long time. So when we think about therapy, Dr. Perry would remind us that it needs to be repeated. We need to have multiple repetitions, time after time. And it is the process of the repetition, not a one and done, but it's repeat, repeat, repeat that will allow all of this process to take place. So as we open up our way of thinking about therapy as being different than maybe what we thought about before, it's longer than maybe what we thought about before, with cause for that to happen. So there are 168 hours in a week. And if you look in the corner, for you guys, it'll probably be on the right-hand side, you'll see a little pale blue square. Do you see that? Everybody? And then the really dark reddish ones are adverse experiences. And the yellow ones are moderately adverse experiences. And then you see this one pale blue dot, that's an hour of therapy. Just look at that. There's no way 1 hour of therapy can work against all the other negative things that might be happening. So we're thinking in therapy about repetition, 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 and expanding the relational health for the child instead of just having 1 hour of therapy. And honestly, I've been in case studies where people say, oh gosh, it's so great they had that hour of therapy. And as Bruce would say, we're not going to get rid of that hour of therapy, but we want to supplement it so that the hour of therapy is actually more effective. And so the new term then for therapeutic is having healing powers and serving to maintain or restore health or well-being. So that expands who a therapist is dramatically. So thinking of the people who could be seen as therapeutic in the life of this child. So we'll go through a few things. Therapy is anything that reduces parental and child stress and supports joy and safety for children and families. That's therapeutic. Therapy is anything that brings or keeps healthy, safe, and nurturing adults into the child's life, whoever that is in the surround of the child. It's anything that would work to reduce or eliminate ACEs. So when I have new clinicians often like, I don't know what to do. I feel like a fraud going out. We'll talk about ACEs sometimes. If you're seeing some of the things that might fit in the ACEs category, let's start there. What could you think about doing about those? And therapy is anything that supports regulation, rhythmic, patterned activity to support regulation, running, walking, drumming, dancing, all of those kinds of things. This is therapy. My grandfather teaches me how to play the guitar, fine motor, relational health, music. So this is therapy. Working to prepare dinner together. This is parallel play. So we're going to prepare dinner together. It's relational health. We're using our fine motor system. Sitting on a caregiver's lap and being read a book, the rhythmicity of reading, looking at the things on the page, being in the arms of my caregiver. Relational health goes up and also cognitive influence. No words for this, right? Look at the joy, the delight. You can see this little one is delighted to be with their caregiver and they're enjoying something together, as is this little girl, laying in the arms of a grandfather, looking at a story on the iPad together, relational health, very therapeutic. And this. So I had a wonderful mentor for many years, Dr. Lusander, and he used to say, if you can't get the dyad to mutual delight, you can't do anything therapeutically. And he was talking about the joy that someone feels their child. With the case of Adam, we asked Caroline, what is it that delights you about Adam? And she said, absolutely nothing. I just want him to get into the juvenile justice system and be out of the house. We did get to mutual delight, I want to tell you. But the story I told earlier is Penelope Leach was a pediatrician in England, and she used to say that the baby says about 100 sounds on the day that the baby is capable of making the sound duh. Do it in your mouth, duh. Where's your tongue have to be to make that sound, duh? So 100 sounds are being said, and suddenly the baby goes, duh. And the caregiver goes, duh, you said duh. And the baby's like, okay, what? And the baby doesn't know anything was different. And then, you know, a little while later, maybe the next day, the baby says, duh. Again, the caregiver said, duh, you said duh. And duh, duh, duh. And the baby begins to figure out something lights my caregiver up when my tongue is against the top of my gums. I make a sound and they go off. And the baby will work for the delight of their caregiver. This is dopamine reward. So the baby works for, we all do, right? We have two kinds of reward, intrinsic reward, like, oh, I felt good, I did that report just right, or extrinsic reward, where someone says, hey, you did a great report, thanks for doing that on time. Extrinsic, intrinsic, dopamine reward, pleasure, it is the fuel for development. So in this, you can see the delight here. So working toward mutual delight is a wonderful way to go. And then we talked about OTs, PTs, SLPs, equine therapy here. So any of those things, a reading tutor, any of those include relational health and also fit within the cognitive world for development. And this, I garden with my grandparents. They're delighted in me. They love everything I'm doing. Look at the grandfather's face, right? They're delighted. And so this fuel for development and for regulation. So Bruce Perry said, the more healthy relationships a child has, the more likely he will be to recover from trauma and thrive. Relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love. So I hope today you leave with a little bit different idea about what therapy is, and I'll turn it over to my colleague who will teach us a lot more about how to expand the therapeutic web so that you can choose therapeutic options. Thank you.
So I can see it in the room, and I'm sure on Zoom there are questions, but we will take questions at the end. And so next we'll have Tony.
Thank you. Very glad to be here with you today. And I'm going to be talking with you about clinical considerations and interventions that we learn in doing NMT. But also I was asked to talk about a little bit about the work that I've done before this. I am currently retired, officially retired 4 years ago. But when I was still working, I was the Deputy Director for Children's Mental Health in San Mateo County. And back in 2011-ish, I saw Dr. Perry in San Francisco. And it, you know, like many of us that had that initial encounter with him and with what he teaches, I just had one of these moments of, you know, oh my gosh, I've been doing it wrong my whole career. And then very quickly, what do we do differently? And at that time, I was a clinical manager over a number of teams in our system. And I brought back the idea of implementing NMT in some way. I wasn't even quite sure at that point the how of it. But I told my deputy director at the time, we have to do this differently. There are too many kids in our system that were failing to keep doing it like this. And the teams that I worked the most closely with as a supervisor and a manager initially in the county were the juvenile probation and the child welfare mental health teams, as well as pre to 3. And I saw my whole career kids going through our systems, and they're, you know, that whole pathway that we talk about oftentimes, of kids that move from child welfare into mental health and then go to juvenile justice and end up in the adult mental health system or the adult incarceration system. And in our county, like in most other places, and I'm sure you know these families too, where we found ourselves working with the grandparents of kids, where the grandparents had been clients, were kids in our system when they were kids, and now they're raising their grandkids who are now in our system. And so we really look at, how do we change this generational transmission of trauma that gets carried on unending? We have to do things differently. So in our state kickoff, I'm going to be doing the facilitation for the statewide learning collaborative. And in getting ready for that, we did a kickoff, and one of the questions that got asked that we didn't have time to address was, how does the neurosequential model translate to specific trauma-informed interventions? And so, I mean, it's the question I think we get asked most often, and usually right away. It's like, okay, what do I do different? And as Dr. Perry was saying, we need to kind of change the way we approach this. This isn't a tool in the sense of, I just need to learn XYZ and that will make my practice different. It's a model, it's a philosophy, it's a way of thinking differently about what we do, how we do it, and how we engage with the people that are coming to us for assistance. And in trauma-informed care, we talk a lot about how this concept of, it's not what you do, but how you do it that makes it trauma-informed. And in some ways, that's the harder thing, right? Learning a new clinical skill is easier than changing the way that you do something, and the intention that you bring to that. And so, for example, in our morning session, I shared that the way that I used to talk about this with juvenile justice, juvenile probation officers, juvenile hall staff, because, you know, the question I would get is, well, how can you be trauma-informed in a juvenile hall? You know, we have to do all kinds of things that are safety and security. We don't have a choice. We have to be in control and, you know, maintain, right? I said, well, okay, let's take an example of that. When a child comes into the juvenile hall, one of the first things that happens to them is they get strip searched, which nobody likes. Nobody really wants to acknowledge that that happens, but it does, because it's policy, it's safety and security. And this is what happens, right? When a child is processed into the juvenile hall. And so I would challenge the hall staff. So if you have to do that, if you have to take a child who's come in, who's already kind of lit up in their stress response system because they've gotten into trouble, who knows what happened to them before they even got here, and you know you have to take them through this procedure, how can you strip search a child and be trauma-informed? How can you do that in a trauma-informed way? Because it is possible. It's not easy, and it doesn't mean that you don't do it. It means the way in which you go about the process of doing that is mindful, compassionate, humane, and it actually asks you to give more time to it so that you have time to explain to them what has to happen, how you're going to do it, what you need them to do so that it goes as smoothly as possible, kind of like in the slide that Dr. Perry showed around stress, where you either help support resilience or you help to support reactivity and what I would call re-traumatization, right? We have choices oftentimes in our work that how we choose to do something makes all the difference. And so there are ways that we can think about all our practices when we're engaging with people, that we could just shift one or two small things, and that in and of itself can make it more trauma informed. than if we just check off the box, do the next thing, and get through our shift, right? We know that doing this model, and I talk a lot about implementing NMT and working within organizations, because that's what I did. I brought it into San Mateo County with the help of a lot of my colleagues there, and some of them are on the call right now. And in 2012, we did our first phase 1 training team. In 2013, we had our trainers group go, very much like what Fresno's planning to do here. And it's been growing since then. So for the last 12 plus years, San Mateo not only implemented it throughout their whole child mental health system, it was so effective and so well received. And we saw outcomes that were amazing to us for a public health system, that the adult mental health clients started hearing about it and started showing up at their consumer boards saying they wanted what the kids were getting. So that put a charge on us to find the funds to make that happen. And so we were able to get a grant where in the last 3 years I was there, we were able to implement NMT in our adult mental health system. And we're the only site that I'm aware of anywhere that's done that. And it's been really powerful, very effective. And my friends and colleagues in San Mateo are still doing that work and expanding it every year with more trainings. And we're seeing changes in our adult seriously mentally ill clients that no one ever expected to be possible. And I'm not trying to, Christy and I were talking about this at the break, trying not to oversell NMT. I always admit I'm a groupie, you just, absolutely. But to be able to see change in kids in a matter of weeks to months versus years or not at all, to actually see changes in adult mental health clients that have been coming to services for years and were exactly the same. And all of a sudden now they're showing up for services. They're not acting out in the waiting area as much as they used to. They're not having as many triggered responses to things. Changes that just weren't expected, people had given up on. And so this is where it really reinforces my belief in NMT and its power to change not only the impact we can have on individuals' lives and families, but the way that it then in a parallel process changes our organizations. And that's the piece that I really bring, is looking at that organizational change along with implementing a clinical tool and a clinical practice, a clinical model, that we know that there's this ripple out that happens over time, that by watching what's happening, even clinicians that aren't trained start to kind of get on the bandwagon and understand that this is really different and I want to know more about this. And that's how it starts to really grow in a grassroots, in a more organic way. We know that the level of support that it takes to support staff to learn this and to do it well, for a system to actually give that kind of support to their teams, that changes the system because people feel supported, they feel valued, they feel better about their work. And so we look for all kinds of organizational shifts and changes that come along with implementing this model in public systems like yours. It changes the lens in which we see families and how they show up in our systems. And that's a really important piece, because what we're talking about, again, is that ability to have compassion instead of judgment, to have understanding instead of frustration. Oh, here they are again. And, the way that we engage with them can change everything about that interaction. And so NMT helps us understand why that's important and what are the things that we can do differently to make that more possible. In this work, we're transforming trauma, not just fixing things. And in this respect, it really, for me anyway, is about understanding how to do this differently, this work that we do. And in doing that, learning what are the things that we can look for upstream that then now we can look to change and do differently that helps alleviate maybe some of the trauma coming down for the families that are coming to us for help, that we see less families, or the issues that they're struggling with aren't as great because we're doing things upstream that changes our communities enough to make that possible. And so I think both things need to be looked at. So just in review, this is what you've been seeing from Dr. Perry and Dr. Brandt, the upside down pyramid brain model. This is from one of our partners in San Mateo County that, so we had a yoga program for a number of years that brought yoga, art and yoga into the juvenile hall for the girls primarily. And we invited them to be part of our training team. Their director, who was a nurse practitioner in neuroscience originally, not only got phase 1 trained, went on to become one of our trainers. Loved the model so much that she took the NMT model and understanding key concepts and completely rewrote their yoga curriculum to match with it. Because what she realized is that the way that they were going about their yoga program was backwards. They were coming in and talking first and then doing yoga instead of coming in, helping everybody get safe, feel safe, comfortable, ready, connected to each other, and do yoga and then talk about what their day was like. And so in redoing their manual, she actually worked directly with Dr. Perry, who's an advisor on their council, and gave his blessing basically to their manual. So now we've got an agency out there in multiple counties doing NMT informed, trauma informed yoga work. And so this is how we build our therapeutic web, is by partnering with groups that have expertise in the areas that we as clinicians don't, and we don't need to know how to do everything, but we do need to know how to partner with people who can and bring them into our NMT community so that we're all working together, because then they become part of your treatment team and they become allies to your families and they become part of your community that helps keep things healthier and safer. And so in this, we show again this level of sequential understanding of how we address different parts of the brain and what a particular individual might be needing in that moment to help their regulation, to help their functioning, and what kinds of things we can look for to help support that. And this slide was actually developed by my partner and co-teacher in San Mateo County, Cindy Donis, who is on the call today. Hello, Cindy. Told her I'd give her a shout out. And so taking that same concept into the framework of how do we do family therapy, for example. And what I love about this is that most times courts, especially attorneys, social workers, probation officers, therapists, teachers, what do we go to for first? We refer people to family therapy and expect that to do the trick. And when it doesn't, it's like, well, why is this family so resistant? Or why don't they want to go? You know, why do they keep leaving or not showing up? And so this is a way of understanding really, again, that regulate, relate, reason concept of, in order to make it safe first, because we're asking them to come into a therapy office or whatever the setting is, visitation center, whatever it might be, and engage with each other around issues that got them in the system to begin with, right? And so if we take the time and are intentional enough to set that up in a way where they can come, kind of settle in, feel safe as they can to begin with, and then move into activities that help build relational quality between them, then we can get to a place where we can start talking about the hard stuff in a way that doesn't just kick off another argument or have somebody storm out the door or have another crisis, right? So again, these are the ways that we can use these concepts to change the way we do things. So when we talk about different kinds of interventions, as Christy went over with you before, some of the examples of what those things might be. When we do our recommendations or our treatment plans in NMT, we look at these 4 domains. And these are the things that are typically listed that we might start looking for referrals for services in these areas to help address whatever underdevelopment or dysregulation there might be, disorganization in the area that, for example, here, the brainstem. And so some things that might be included here would be healing touch or massage. And I gave the example earlier today of our pre-to-3 team. A number of the clinicians went and got trained in therapeutic touch massage, brought it back in and started doing parent-baby groups, mom and baby groups. And we saw very quickly, literally within weeks' time, changes in, moms who were depressed, postpartum depression, and babies that were really flaccid and floppy, kind of perking up and engaging with each other in a way that they weren't doing before, or moms that were highly stressed and anxious and uptight, and babies that were really rigid, that couldn't tolerate any kind of input at all, start to relax and engage with each other in a way that they weren't doing before. Very effective. The thing about NMT that I've learned is the younger the child, the faster the change, because developmentally, that's how it works, right? So that doesn't mean with an older kid you wouldn't try, or with an adult you wouldn't try. You're going to see the change too. It's just going to take longer. And that's part of the developmental aspect of what we're doing. So the earlier we can intervene, the better the outcomes, the faster the outcomes. So we know that we regulate through our senses: auditory, visual, touch, smell, taste, and that this is both the basis for the way that we look at interventions for the systems that need this kind of input. These are also the things that we start assessing for when we do sensory integration assessments, which are really critical, because we know so many of the kids that we are seeing are coming in with sensory differences, neuro differences that have not been identified, have gotten misdiagnosed and misaddressed and medicated. And oftentimes, medication is not the treatment. It's really doing the OT and the other kind of sensory, somatosensory interventions that are needed to help that child's system learn how to adapt and function. In self-regulation, we look at, again, OT services, sleep hygiene. We used to use the sleep hygiene protocol in our residential and juvenile hall settings because kids there we knew had sleep issues. And so this becomes a very important part of self-regulation. Music, movement, walking, running, exercising, guided imagery, relational regulatory time. I like this one because this could be as simple as referring or suggesting to a parent and child to go to the park twice a week and just swing next to each other. They don't have to talk about anything serious. Just go be with each other, have that relational time, and do something that's regulating. And that's what swinging is. And so this is how you can build on these things to create a therapeutic interaction that has nothing to do with talk therapy. We know that creative arts is really effective, and so is gardening. I started a horticultural gardening program in San Mateo County that's still in operation. And anywhere you can find green time, green space, gardening alternatives, it's a great therapeutic rehab service. We actually in our county encouraged and got some of our child docs to start prescribing green time before they did medications. And that's a wonderful change, because then you can omit something if it's really about the fact that this kid just needs to get out and play. And it's not that they're hyperactive and need a medication. you don't know that until you start ruling those things out. So we know that, again, regulating through the senses is proprioceptive and vestibular activation, and that there's many ways that we can affect this and build this into the week of the child. It's not necessarily that we have to do all these things, but that we're working with people who do provide these options and experiences. In the limbic system, we're looking at different kinds of parallel play, small group activities, as Christy was saying, and you want to build from where their best tolerance is and move from there. Don't put them in something that you think is age appropriate for them because of their chronological age. We really want to look at what is their functional capacity, what is their developmental capacity, and start from there, and then help them build mastery from there. Animal-assisted therapy is probably one of the best supportive therapies that we can build into any program, both with animal service animals in the clinics, but also in equine therapy is one of the things that in San Mateo County, we built up a pretty robust contract with an equine therapy provider and was able to grow that from just individual sessions with kids to incorporating and including parents, and then being able to offer that to our adult clients as well. And it's a really healing intervention. Anything that we can do out in nature, I'm a big proponent of that because it really helps to support the mindfulness and meditation and the internal self-regulation that we're really trying to encourage and support. And then for cortical interventions, we're looking more at things like speech and language, reading, storytelling, as you were seeing in other presentations. Cultural anchors are really important. And then here we have insight-oriented psychotherapy, CBT, family therapy. So you can see where these therapies come in. They're kind of at the end, right? So it's not that we don't do them. It's not that they don't have value. But again, we need to be very mindful about when we do it and why we're doing it. And are there other things that need to happen first so that the benefit of these types of interventions can be maximized? And Dr. Perry talked about neurofeedback. This is one of the newer treatments that is getting used more widely. It's just one of the ways that we can activate the bilateral stimulation that helps with a lot of different kind of brain functions. And then finally, the therapeutic web. This was a slide that we developed for our trainings in San Mateo County. Is really a way of looking at not only how we build out services in our community in NMT, it's also how we do our recommendations, our treatment plan, basically, that it's not just for the child or the individual client. We're really looking at, in order for this person to do well and to maintain the progress that we're wanting them to have, the healing, what is happening in the family that needs to be supported so that's possible? What do the parents need? What do the siblings need? And then within the community, what is in that ecosystem that also needs to have support or that needs to be added in order to support the family to support their child? So again, it's a much wider web. And it's also a way of kind of seeing, okay, what's already present in their lives and what's missing? What are the things that we need to think about that maybe we can offer that will help support and enhance the work that we're doing with this family? And so it's just a different way of looking at what it means to have a therapeutic web. It is our community, it's our family, it's our individuals, but it's also the way that we engage with all of those things. So with that, I will finish. And thank you very much for having me here today.
This formally kicks off our partnership to bring the neurosequential model here to Fresno. We do have an identified cohort 1, pretty exciting. And so the cohort training starts in May. And then our general trainings, we hope to get the training portal and to get people access to that starting in June. And so we're super excited to bring this to our community. And with that, I am going to thank everyone, and we will be signing off from Zoom. So thank you, everyone in the room. Thank you, everyone in Zoom. And we are super excited to be bringing this. Oh, one final thing. We are the first county to kick off. This is a statewide learning collaborative with the the California Department of Social Services. Tony did not give herself credit. She is also part of the statewide implementation, but we are privileged that Tony will be our trainer and facilitator here in Fresno as well for our cohort. So we are just over the moon that we are able to bring this to our community in partnership with our other partners. And then in the future, we are expanding the cohort training to tribes, school districts, probation. We really want this to be the way that our community collectively heals. So thank you, everyone.